The war had taken everything from Vernon Donnelly except his ability to dig, and it was that single skill, learned in trenches and burial details outside Franklin, Tennessee, that brought him back in the spring of 1867 to the same stretch of Missouri earth where he had once buried 3 of his closest friends beneath a stand of white oaks. He came back with a mule, a plow he had traded 2 months' wages for, and a canvas sack containing everything he owned in the world: a spare shirt, a razor, a tintype of his mother who had passed while he was away fighting, and the deed to 80 acres that his father had left him before dying of the fever that swept through the county the winter after Vernon enlisted. The land itself remembered the war better than most men wanted to. There were still scars in the earth where cannon had been dragged through, still a blackened foundation where the Prout farmhouse had stood before Confederate raiders burned it in 1863, and still, if a man walked far enough toward the eastern ridge, the shallow depressions where trenches had once run like open wounds across the pasture. Vernon had fought for the Union, had marched with the Missouri Volunteers through 4 years of a war that had turned neighbor against neighbor in a state that never fully decided which side it belonged to, and he had come home with a limp in his left leg from a ball that had never been properly removed, and a silence in him that unsettled the few relatives who still remained in the county. He did not speak of the war. He did not speak of much at all in those first weeks, only worked the land from the gray hour before dawn until the light failed him each evening, breaking soil that had gone hard and untended for the better part of 6 years, pulling stones the size of a man's head from furrows that had once grown corn tall enough to hide a boy from his mother's calling. It was in his second week back, while he was clearing brush from what had once been his father's kitchen garden, that he first heard the wagon. The road that ran past the Donnelly land connected the county seat of Lexington to the smaller settlements further west, and traffic on it had grown thin since the war, most families having fled east or simply given up and gone further west to California or Oregon, where the fighting had never reached. So when Vernon heard the creak of wheels and the tired complaint of a horse pulling too heavy a load, he straightened from his work and watched the road with the wary attention of a man who had spent 4 years learning to notice everything before it noticed him. The wagon that came into view was driven by a woman alone, and even from a distance Vernon could see that something was wrong with it. The rear axle sagged at an angle that spoke of a broken wheel poorly mended, and the horse pulling it walked with its head low, exhausted past the point of complaint. He watched the wagon make it another 100 yards before the wheel gave out entirely, the whole conveyance lurching sideways into the ditch with a crack of splintering wood that carried clear across the field to where he stood. Vernon did not think long before he was moving, his limp forgotten in the urgency of it, because he had heard no cry of pain from the wagon, and that silence worried him more than screaming would have. When he reached the road, he found the woman already climbing down from the driver's bench. Her skirts caught for a moment on a splinter of wood before she freed them with an irritated tug, and she straightened to face him with an expression that held far more anger than fear. "I am fine," she said before he had asked, "though this wagon most certainly is not, and neither, I suspect, is this horse, who I have been assured by 3 separate men in Lexington was sound in wind and limb." Vernon looked at the horse, whose ribs showed plainly beneath a coat that had not been properly curried in some time, and then at the wheel, which had not simply cracked but had been rotting from the inside for months. "Those 3 men lied to you," he said. The woman turned her full attention on him then, and Vernon found himself the subject of a scrutiny as thorough as any he had received from an officer inspecting troops. She was perhaps 24 or 25 years of age, with dark hair escaping its pins in a manner that suggested she had given up trying to control it somewhere around the Kansas border, and eyes the color of good coffee that seemed to be cataloging everything about him, from his sun-browned hands to the way he favored his left leg. "I am aware of that now," she said. "I was not aware of it when I purchased the wagon and horse both from a man named Kessler in Lexington, who assured me most sincerely that both would carry me and my belongings to the property I have recently inherited, some 6 miles west of here. 6 miles west would put you past my land and onto the old Whitfield place, Vernon said, which has stood empty since the widow Whitfield passed 2 years back. I am aware of that as well, the woman said, as I am her niece, and the property is now mine, along with whatever debts and disrepair have accumulated upon it in her absence, which I am given to understand is considerable. Vernon studied the wreckage of the wagon again, then the woman's face, which despite its irritation held a kind of steady resolve that reminded him, oddly, of men he had served with who had learned to face bad news without flinching. "My name is Vernon Donnelly," he said. "My land runs along this road for the better part of a mile behind me. You are welcome to leave your wagon here until it can be properly repaired, and I have a second horse that can pull whatever needs pulling until then, if you are willing to trust a stranger with your belongings." The woman considered this offer with the same careful attention she had given his leg, and after a long moment she extended her hand in a manner more suited to a business transaction than an introduction. "Gertrude Keating," she said, "and given that my alternative is sleeping in a broken wagon on the side of a Missouri road, I believe I am willing to trust you, Mr. Donnelly, at least as far as the matter of the horse." It took the better part of 2 hours to transfer Gertrude Keating's belongings from the ruined wagon to Vernon's own cart, and in that time Vernon learned that she had come from Ohio, where she had spent the war years nursing wounded soldiers in a hospital in Cincinnati, and that she had no family remaining there worth speaking of, her parents having died of typhoid fever when she was 17, and her only brother having been killed at Shiloh in 1862. "I am sorry," Vernon said, when she told him this, and something in the plainness of it, the lack of practiced sympathy, seemed to earn him a measure of her trust. "I was sorry too," she said, "for a long time. I have found that being sorry accomplishes very little, however, and so I have tried to occupy myself instead with being useful. It is why I nursed for as long as I did, and why I have come west now, to make something of my aunt's land rather than sell it and return to a city that holds nothing for me." Vernon found himself, as they worked, studying her more closely than he had studied anything in some time. There was a directness to her that he was not accustomed to in women, a willingness to speak her mind that he suspected had been earned through hard years rather than given freely, and he found himself wanting in a way that surprised him to know more of those years. "You fought," she said, not a question, as they loaded the last of her trunks. "I have nursed enough soldiers to recognize the way a man carries himself afterward." "Where?" "Tennessee, mostly," Vernon said. "Franklin at the end." Something passed across Gertrude's face at the mention of Franklin, a flicker of memory that she did not elaborate on, and Vernon did not press her, understanding as few men could that some memories were better left undisturbed. "I nursed men from Franklin," she said finally. "That was a terrible business." "It was," Vernon agreed, and offered nothing more, and Gertrude, to her credit, did not ask for more, seeming to understand that the war had left wounds in him that no amount of nursing could reach. They reached the Whitfield place as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in colors that Vernon had once thought beautiful before the war had taught him to see everything through a haze of remembered smoke. And even that haze seemed to lift somewhat as he watched Gertrude Keating climb down from his cart and survey her inheritance with an expression that mixed dismay with determination in equal measure. The house was smaller than the Donnelly place, a simple two-room structure that had clearly not been properly maintained since the widow Whitfield's health had begun to fail, with a roof that showed daylight through more than one gap and a porch that sagged dangerously on its left side. "Well," Gertrude said, after a long silence, "it is not Cincinnati." "No," Vernon agreed, "it is not." "I suppose that is precisely why I came," she said, and there was something in her voice, some determination not to be defeated by the sight before her, that made Vernon want to offer whatever help he could, though he was careful, in that first evening, to offer only what was practical and nothing more. He helped her carry her belongings into the house, checked the well to ensure the water was still good, and split enough kindling to see her through the night before he took his leave, promising to return the following morning to look at the roof. "You do not need to trouble yourself further, Mr. Donnelly," Gertrude said, though there was less conviction in the protest than there might have been. "You have already done more than I had any right to expect from a stranger." "We are neighbors now, Miss Keating," Vernon said. "Neighbors help each other in this country. It is likely the only way either of us survives what is coming." He did not explain what he meant by that, and Gertrude did not ask, though she watched him limp back toward his cart with an expression that suggested she had already guessed a portion of what troubled him and filed it away for later understanding. True to his word, Vernon returned the following morning, and the morning after that, and within 2 weeks the roof of the Whitfield house no longer showed daylight. The porch had been properly braced, and the well had been cleaned of the debris that had accumulated during the widow's final illness. In that time, Vernon and Gertrude fell into an easy rhythm of work and conversation that neither had quite expected. Gertrude, it turned out, knew a great deal about medicine and remarkably little about farming, while Vernon knew everything about coaxing crops from difficult soil and remarkably little about anything that had happened in the wider world during his 4 years away. "You truly did not know the war had ended until you were mustered out?" Gertrude asked one afternoon, as she helped him plant the first rows of corn in soil that had lain fallow far too long. "We knew," Vernon said. "But knowing a thing and feeling it are different matters. I think some part of me is still marching some days." Gertrude was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the dark earth. "I understand that better than you might expect," she said. "I spent 4 years watching men die in numbers that no city should have to bear witness to, and when the fighting stopped, I found I did not know how to stop watching for the wounded to arrive. I still wake some mornings expecting the sound of wagons bringing more of them." "Does it fade?" Vernon asked, and there was a rawness in the question that surprised even him. "Some," Gertrude said. "Not all." "I think perhaps it is not meant to fade entirely, Mr. Donnelly. I think perhaps we are meant to carry it, and to find some way of living alongside it rather than waiting for it to leave us." Vernon considered this as he pressed seed into soil, and found that it made more sense to him than anything the well-meaning relatives who had welcomed him home had offered in the way of comfort. "You may call me Vernon," he said, after a long silence, "if we are to be neighbors who help each other survive what is coming." Gertrude smiled at that, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face in a way that made Vernon's chest tighten with a feeling he had not permitted himself in some years. "Then you may call me Gertrude," she said, "though I warn you now, Vernon Donnelly, that I do not intend to be the sort of neighbor who simply accepts help without offering it in return. I intend to learn to farm, whether this Missouri soil wishes to cooperate with me or not." True to that promise, Gertrude threw herself into learning the work of the land with the same determination she had shown toward nursing, and Vernon found himself, over the following months, teaching her everything he knew: how to judge when soil was ready for planting, how to recognize the signs of blight before it spread, how to mend fence and shoe a horse and butcher a hog when the time came for it. In turn, Gertrude taught him things he had not expected to need: tending to the wound in his leg that had never properly healed, cleaning it and dressing it with a skill that spoke to years of practice. And slowly, through patient care that Vernon initially resisted out of pride before surrendering to necessity, easing some of the pain that had plagued him since the ball had first torn through muscle outside Franklin. "You should have had this looked at properly years ago," Gertrude said, the first time she examined it, her fingers gentle but firm as she assessed the old scar tissue. "There was not much looking to be had in the field hospitals," Vernon said. "A man was fortunate to keep his leg at all, let alone have it properly tended." "Well, you have kept it," Gertrude said, "and I intend to see that it serves you better than it has been serving you. This will hurt, I am afraid, before it improves." It did hurt in the weeks that followed, as Gertrude worked to break up scar tissue that had bound muscle in ways that limited his movement. But Vernon found that he did not mind the pain nearly as much as he might have expected, not when it came paired with her careful hands and the low murmur of her voice as she worked, asking him questions about his childhood on this land, about his mother who had died while he was away, about the small joys he remembered from before the war had swallowed everything. "Tell me about her," Gertrude said one evening, as she worked at his leg by lamplight in the kitchen of the Whitfield house, where such treatments had become a regular occurrence. "Your mother, she loved this land," Vernon said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "Loved it more than my father did, I think, though he was the one who worked it. She used to say that Missouri soil was stubborn but honest, that it would give you exactly what you put into it and nothing more, nothing less." "She sounds as though she would have liked you learning to plant corn again," Gertrude said. "She would have liked you," Vernon said, before he could stop himself, and then felt his face warm at the admission, though Gertrude only smiled and continued her work as though he had said nothing extraordinary at all, though the small upturn of her mouth suggested otherwise. The seasons turned, as seasons do, and by the autumn of that first year, both the Donnelly and Whitfield properties showed the marks of careful tending. Vernon's corn had come in better than he had dared hope, and Gertrude, with his guidance, had managed to coax a respectable garden from soil that had lain neglected for years, along with a small flock of chickens she had purchased from a farm further south. It was during the harvest that Vernon first understood the full depth of what had grown between them, on an evening when a sudden storm caught them both in Gertrude's field, working to bring in the last of her pumpkin crop before the rain could rot it in the ground. They worked in a frantic rush against the darkening sky, hauling pumpkins to the shelter of her small barn, and by the time the last one was safely stored, the rain had come in earnest, soaking them both through despite their efforts, and they stood in the doorway of the barn laughing at their own foolishness in a way that Vernon could not remember laughing since before the war. "We are both entirely soaked," Gertrude said, wringing water from her sleeve with mock solemnity, "and I have lost at least one boot somewhere in that field which I do not intend to search for until morning." "I will find it for you," Vernon said, "once this storm breaks." "You will do no such thing tonight," Gertrude said. "You will come inside and dry yourself by my fire, and we will speak no more of boots until the sun has returned." Vernon followed her into the small house, and as she built up the fire and set water to warming for tea, he found himself watching her with an intensity that he could no longer pretend was simply neighborly regard. "Gertrude," he said, and something in his voice made her turn from the fire to look at him directly. "Yes, Vernon." "I have been thinking," he said, and found the words more difficult to arrange than he had expected, though he had faced Confederate artillery with less trepidation than he felt now. "I have been thinking that this past year has been the first year since the war that I have felt something other than simply enduring, and I believe that is because of you." Gertrude set down the kettle she had been holding, her attention fully on him now, her dark eyes searching his face with an openness he had not seen from her before. "I have felt something similar," she said quietly. "I came west intending to build a life for myself alone, Vernon, having decided that I did not require anyone else to make that life complete. But I find that your company has become something I look forward to in a way I had not anticipated, and did not, if I am honest, entirely welcome at first." "And now?" Vernon asked. "Now I welcome it a great deal," Gertrude said, and the honesty in her voice, the lack of coyness that so many women employed in matters of the heart, struck Vernon as the most beautiful thing he had encountered since returning from the war. He crossed the small room to stand before her, close enough now that he could see the fire's light reflected in her eyes, close enough to smell the rain still clinging to her hair. "May I kiss you, Gertrude Keating?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he had not permitted himself in years. "You may," she said, "though I warn you, Vernon Donnelly, that I do not offer such permission lightly, and I will expect you to understand what it means before you take it." "I understand," Vernon said, and closed the distance between them, and their first kiss, there in the small kitchen with rain still drumming against the roof, tasted of rainwater and wood smoke and something that felt to both of them remarkably like coming home after a long absence. When they finally parted, Gertrude rested her forehead against his chest, and Vernon wrapped his arms around her with a gentleness that belied the strength the war had built into him. "I did not expect this," Gertrude admitted. "When I came west, I expected hardship and solitude and perhaps, if I was fortunate, some measure of peace with the land itself. I did not expect to fall in love with my neighbor. Nor did I expect to find my heart mended by a woman who mends soldiers' wounds," Vernon said. "But I find that I am grateful for it, more grateful than I have words to properly express." They stood together in that small kitchen for a long while, listening to the storm gradually ease outside, and when Vernon finally took his leave that night, walking home through mud and lingering rain, he found that his limp bothered him less than it had in months, as though the very act of loving Gertrude Keating had begun to heal parts of him he had believed permanently broken. Their courtship, once begun, proceeded with the same steady determination that characterized everything Gertrude Keating undertook. She did not believe in half measures. She informed Vernon on more than one occasion, and having decided that she loved him, she intended to make certain he understood the full weight and permanence of that love. Vernon, for his part, found himself courting her with a formality that surprised him, bringing small gifts when he visited. Wildflowers gathered from the eastern ridge, where the old trenches had finally begun to fill with new growth. A book of poetry he had ordered from a catalog, and had delivered to the Lexington post office. A hand-carved wooden box he had spent 3 evenings crafting to hold the small collection of pressed flowers Gertrude had begun keeping from their walks together. "You did not need to make this," Gertrude said, examining the box with evident delight, running her fingers over the careful joints and the small carved rose he had added to the lid. "I wanted to," Vernon said. "There is something in working with my hands that helps me feel steady, Gertrude. The war took a great deal from me, but it did not take my ability to build things, and I find I want to build things for you now, rather than simply survive on my own account." It was around this time, as autumn deepened toward winter, that Vernon finally spoke to Gertrude about Franklin, about the battle that had claimed his closest friends and left the scar in his leg that would never fully heal. He had not intended to speak of it, had in fact avoided the subject with a determination that Gertrude had respected without pressing. But one evening, as they sat before the fire in his own house, having taken to spending evenings together now that the whole county understood their courtship, the words simply came. "There was a boy in my company," Vernon said, staring into the flames rather than at Gertrude, "named Thomas Ashby. He was 17, had lied about his age to enlist, and he used to talk about the farm his family had in Ohio, about how he intended to return and marry a girl named Sarah who had promised to wait for him." Gertrude said nothing, only reached over to take his hand, understanding instinctively that he needed to tell this story in his own time, in his own way. "He died in my arms at Franklin," Vernon continued, his voice steady despite the memory. "Bled out from a wound that should not have killed him if we had gotten him to a surgeon faster, if the fighting had allowed us any chance to reach the field hospital. I held him as he died, and he asked me to write to Sarah to tell her that he loved her, and I promised I would." "Did you?" Gertrude asked softly. "I did," Vernon said. "I wrote to her within the week, though I did not know if the letter would ever reach her, given the chaos of that time. I never received a reply, and I have wondered ever since whether she received my words, whether they offered her any comfort at all, or whether they simply added to grief she was already carrying." "I am certain they offered comfort," Gertrude said. "Even grief shared is easier to carry than grief endured alone, Vernon. You gave her that, whatever else came of it." Vernon turned to look at her then, and found in her eyes the same steady understanding that had drawn him to her from their very first meeting on that rutted Missouri road. "I have never told anyone that story," he said. "Not my mother before she passed, not the relatives who welcomed me home and wished to hear tales of glory rather than grief. I have carried it alone for 4 years." "You need not carry it alone any longer," Gertrude said. "I am here, Vernon, and I intend to remain here if you will have me, for as long as we both shall live." It was, though neither of them named it as such in that moment, very nearly a proposal, and Vernon understood it as one. Understood that Gertrude Keating was offering him not simply comfort in the present, but partnership for whatever future remained to them. He did not propose that evening, though the impulse rose in him strongly enough that he had to consciously restrain it, believing that such a moment deserved more ceremony than a spontaneous declaration before a fire, however heartfelt. Instead, he spent the following weeks planning, consulting with Gertrude's few acquaintances in Lexington about what ring might suit her, working extra hours to afford the small diamond he eventually settled upon, a modest stone but a genuine one, purchased from a jeweler who had only recently opened shop in the growing town. The proposal itself came on a clear December morning, nearly 8 months after Gertrude Keating's wagon had broken down on the road before Vernon Donnelly's land, on the eastern ridge, where the old war trenches had finally, after years of neglect, begun to fill in with new grass and wildflowers that had somehow found purchase in ground that had once seen only violence. "I wanted to bring you here," Vernon said, as they stood together looking out over land that stretched toward the horizon in every direction, "because this ground holds the worst memories of my life, Gertrude. This is where I trained before Franklin, where I first understood what war truly meant, where I buried friends before the fighting even properly began." "Why bring me here, then, of all places?" Gertrude asked, though something in her voice suggested she had already begun to understand. "Because I want this ground to hold better memories too," Vernon said. "I want it to remember not just what was lost here, but what was found here. I found you, Gertrude Keating, on a road that runs alongside this very field, and I have found in you a peace I did not believe I would ever know again after everything the war took from me." He knelt then, despite the protest of his old wound, and produced the ring he had carried in his pocket for 3 days, waiting for the proper moment to present it. "I love you," he said, "more completely than I have loved anything in my life, including this land that raised me and this country that I fought to preserve. I am asking you to marry me, to build a life with me on this ground where I once knew only war, so that together we might teach it and ourselves what peace truly means." Gertrude's eyes had filled with tears well before he finished speaking, and when he held out the ring, she did not hesitate before extending her hand to receive it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Vernon Donnelly, I will marry you, and I will help you make this land into something better than what it was, something worthy of the man you have become despite everything the war tried to make of you." They were married in the spring of 1868, in a small ceremony held in the Lexington church that had somehow survived the war intact, attended by the handful of relatives who remained to Vernon, and the few acquaintances Gertrude had made in her time in Missouri. It was not a large wedding, nor an elaborate one, but it was joyous in a way that both of them felt deeply, a celebration not simply of their love but of survival, of two people who had each endured great loss finding in each other a reason to hope again. The reception, held in the Donnelly barn which Vernon had spent weeks preparing for the occasion, decorated with wildflowers and lit by lanterns that cast a warm, golden glow over the gathered guests, extended well into the evening, with music provided by a local fiddler and dancing that Vernon, despite his leg, insisted on participating in for at least the first dance with his new wife. "You need not push yourself on my account," Gertrude said, as he led her through the steps of a simple waltz, wincing slightly at the strain on his leg. "I would push myself considerably further than this for you, Gertrude Donnelly," Vernon said, testing her new name on his tongue with evident pleasure, and I intend to dance with you at our wedding regardless of what my leg has to say about the matter." They settled, after the wedding, into the Donnelly house, having decided together that Vernon's property, being slightly larger and in better repair, made more practical sense as their primary home, while Gertrude's inherited land would be worked as an extension of their combined holdings. The Whitfield house eventually converted into additional storage and, later, housing for the hired help they would need as their operation grew. The first year of their marriage was not without its difficulties. Farming remained an unpredictable business, subject to the whims of weather and market prices that neither of them could control. And there were seasons when the harvest disappointed, when money grew tight enough that they discussed, with the practical seriousness that characterized their partnership, whether Vernon might need to take additional work in Lexington to see them through a lean winter. There was also the matter of Vernon's occasional dark moods, evenings when the war returned to him in dreams so vivid that he would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, momentarily uncertain whether he lay in his own bed or in some field hospital tent, with the sounds of battle still echoing around him. Gertrude learned to recognize the signs of these episodes before they fully manifested, the particular tension in his shoulders as evening approached after a day that had reminded him too acutely of something from the war, the way his eyes would sometimes go distant and unfocused when a sudden loud noise startled him. "I am sorry," he told her, after one particularly severe nightmare had left him shaking in her arms in the middle of the night, ashamed of the fear he could not entirely suppress even in the safety of his own home, with his wife beside him. "I did not intend for you to marry a man still haunted by ghosts." "I did not marry a perfect man, Vernon," Gertrude said, holding him close as his breathing gradually steadied. "I married you, ghosts and all, and I intend to help you carry whatever weight those ghosts represent for as long as you need me to. This is not a burden to me. This is simply what it means to love someone who has survived something terrible." Her patience with him during these episodes never wavered, and gradually, over the months and then years of their marriage, the episodes themselves grew less frequent, less severe, as though the steady rhythm of farm work and the deep security of Gertrude's love slowly rebuilt in Vernon what the war had torn down. It was not only Vernon who required understanding in their marriage, however, for Gertrude carried her own scars from her years of nursing, memories of dying soldiers that visited her in quiet moments, particularly whenever illness struck their own small household or the broader community around them. When a fever swept through Lexington in the summer of 1869, claiming several children including the young son of their nearest neighbors, Gertrude spent 3 days and nights at the bedside of the stricken family, doing everything in her power to save lives that ultimately could not be saved, and returned home afterward hollowed out by grief in a way that required Vernon's patient care in turn. "I could not save him," she said, referring to the neighbor's boy, a child of only 6 years who had succumbed despite everything Gertrude's nursing skill could offer. "I have watched so many die, Vernon, soldiers and now children both, and I wonder sometimes whether I have simply been placed on this earth to witness death without any power to prevent it." "You saved others," Vernon reminded her gently, holding her as she wept in a manner she rarely permitted herself. "The Hendricks girl would not have survived without your care, nor would old Mr. Ablewhite's pneumonia have resolved without your attention. You cannot save everyone, my love, but you save more than most would, and that matters, even when it does not feel like enough." Their partnership, forged initially in shared understanding of war's aftermath, deepened over these early years of marriage into something that encompassed every aspect of their lives together, from the practical business of running their combined farms to the emotional labor of tending each other's wounds, both physical and otherwise. By 1870, their hard work had begun to show clear results. The Donnelly farm, now properly the Donnelly-Keating farm in the informal parlance of their neighbors, had expanded its production considerably, with Vernon's careful management of the corn and wheat fields supplemented by Gertrude's growing expertise in raising livestock, an interest she had developed after their marriage and pursued with characteristic determination. It was also in 1870 that Gertrude announced, on a spring evening much like the one that had brought them together 3 years prior, that she was expecting their first child. "Are you certain?" Vernon asked, though the question was mere formality, as he could see the certainty already settled in her face. "I have nursed enough expecting mothers to recognize the signs in myself," Gertrude said. "I am certain, Vernon. We are going to have a child." Vernon's reaction to this news surprised even himself, a wave of emotion so profound that he found himself unable to speak for several long moments, simply pulling Gertrude into an embrace that spoke more clearly than words could have managed. "I did not know I wanted this so completely," he finally said, "until you told me it was happening. I have thought, since the war, that perhaps I did not deserve such happiness, that a man who had done what I was forced to do in battle should not expect the ordinary blessings of life. But I find that I want this child more than I have wanted anything, Gertrude, and I am grateful beyond words that you are the one who will be its mother." "You deserve every happiness this life can offer," Gertrude said firmly. "The war asked terrible things of you, Vernon, but it does not define what you deserve now, in the peace you have worked so hard to build. You are a good man, and you will be a wonderful father, and I intend to see both of us thoroughly enjoy this next chapter of our lives together." Their first child, a son they named Thomas after the young soldier Vernon had held as he died at Franklin, was born in the winter of 1871, during a snowstorm severe enough that Vernon had feared they would not reach the doctor in Lexington in time. In the end, the child arrived with the assistance of a neighboring woman experienced in midwifery, in their own bedroom, with Vernon pacing the hallway outside in an agony of worry that Gertrude later teased him about mercilessly once the danger had passed and both mother and child were declared healthy. "You would think, given how calmly you face a difficult harvest or a sick horse, that you might manage childbirth with similar composure," Gertrude said, some weeks after Thomas's birth, as she nursed their son by the fire while Vernon watched with an expression of such tender wonder that it made her heart ache with love for him. "There is no comparing the two," Vernon said. "A difficult harvest risks our livelihood. This risked you, and our child both, and I do not believe I have ever known such fear as I felt those hours you labored, Gertrude. I would face Franklin again a dozen times over rather than experience that fear once more." "Well," Gertrude said, "you may have opportunity to test that resolve, as I do not intend for Thomas to be an only child should fortune favor us with more." Fortune did indeed favor them, for over the following years, the Donnelly household grew steadily. A daughter, Margaret, named for Gertrude's own mother, arrived in 1873, followed by a second son, Charles, in 1876, named for no particular relative, but simply because both parents had liked the name upon hearing it mentioned by a traveling preacher who had passed through Lexington that year. As their family grew, so too did their farm, expanding through careful management and the occasional purchase of additional acreage from neighbors who had decided, for various reasons, to sell their own holdings and move further west or return east to family. By 1875, the Donnelly farm had grown to encompass nearly 300 acres, worked partly by Vernon and his growing sons as they aged, and partly by hired hands they employed during the busy seasons of planting and harvest. The eastern ridge, where Vernon had once proposed to Gertrude amid the fading scars of old war trenches, had by this time transformed entirely, the trenches long since filled and grown over, now home to a small orchard of apple trees that Gertrude had planted in the years following their marriage, trees that by the mid-1870s had begun producing fruit in quantities sufficient to sell at the Lexington market alongside their other crops. It was on this same ridge, in the autumn of 1876, that Vernon brought his eldest son Thomas, then 5 years old, to tell him something of the land's history, feeling that the boy was old enough to begin understanding what his father had endured, and what the ground beneath their feet had witnessed before it became the peaceful orchard they now stood within. "This ground saw terrible things once," Vernon told his son, as they walked among the apple trees that Gertrude had so carefully tended. "Men fought and died here, Thomas, in a war that divided this whole country, brother against brother in some cases. I was a soldier in that war, and I saw things here that I hope you never have to see in your own lifetime." Thomas, young as he was, listened with the serious attention that even small children sometimes bring to matters they sense are important, though he could not yet fully comprehend the weight of what his father described. "Did you kill people, Papa?" the boy asked, with the blunt directness of childhood that often cuts more sharply than intended questions from adults. "I did," Vernon said, deciding that honesty, tempered with appropriate care for his son's young age, served better than evasion. "I did terrible things, Thomas, because the war demanded them, because I believed I was fighting to preserve something important, to end the terrible practice of slavery that had divided our country for so long. But those things I did left scars on me, scars you cannot see but that I carry still." "Is that why your leg hurts sometimes?" Thomas asked. "That is one of the scars, yes," Vernon said, "though there are others that have nothing to do with my leg. But I want you to know, Thomas, that this land, this very ground where terrible things happened, has become something beautiful instead. Your mother and I built this life together on ground that once knew only war, and we have made it into something that gives life instead of taking it. That is important for you to understand, that even the worst places can become good again, with enough love and enough patient work." "Like the apple trees," Thomas said, with the simple wisdom that children sometimes stumble into without fully understanding the depth of what they say. "Yes," Vernon said, feeling something in his chest ease at his son's understanding, however partial. "Exactly like the apple trees, Thomas. Nothing stays broken forever, not if you are willing to do the work of healing it." That evening, when Vernon related this conversation to Gertrude as they sat together on their porch watching the sun set over land that had become, through years of shared labor and love, something entirely their own, Gertrude took his hand and held it against her cheek with a tenderness that spoke more than any words could have. "You have healed this land," she said, "and you have healed yourself in the process, Vernon Donnelly. I have watched you do it. These 9 years we have been married, and I have never been prouder of anyone in my life." "I could not have done it without you," Vernon said. "You found me still fighting a war that had already ended, Gertrude, still marching through battles that existed only in my memory. You gave me a reason to stop marching, to put down roots instead, and I am grateful every single day for the chance you took on a broken stranger with a bad leg and a wagon that needed fixing." "You fixed considerably more than my wagon that day," Gertrude said, smiling at the memory that had started everything between them. "You fixed something in my heart that I did not even know needed fixing, some emptiness I had carried since losing my parents and my brother, some belief that I would need to face this world entirely alone. You gave me a family, Vernon, and a home, and a love I did not believe I deserved to find twice in one lifetime, having already lost so much before I ever met you." They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness settled fully over their farm, the sounds of their children playing in the yard gradually giving way to the quieter business of evening chores and preparation for supper. And Vernon found himself, as he often did in these peaceful moments, marveling at the distance. He had traveled from the broken man who had returned from war in 1867, uncertain if he would ever know anything but the weight of what he had witnessed and done. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of farm life, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children, who each in turn learned the business of working the land their parents had built together. Thomas, showing an early aptitude for the practical mechanics of farming, took to working alongside his father from a young age, learning to plow and plant, and eventually, as he grew older, to manage aspects of the business side of their operation, negotiating prices at the Lexington market with a shrewdness that made his parents proud. Margaret, meanwhile, showed her mother's aptitude for healing, following Gertrude on visits to sick neighbors and gradually developing skills in herbal medicine and basic nursing that would, in later years, make her invaluable to the growing community around Lexington, which by the 1880s had expanded considerably as more families moved into the region, drawn by the same promise of fertile land and fresh starts that had originally brought Gertrude Keating west. Charles, their youngest, proved to have inherited something of his father's quiet thoughtfulness, less interested in the practical business of farming than his older brother, but deeply attached to the land itself, spending hours as a young boy simply walking the property, learning every rise and hollow, every stream and stand of trees, in a manner that eventually led him, as an adult, to take particular interest in the orchard his mother had planted, expanding it considerably and eventually establishing a modest business, selling preserved fruits and cider throughout the region. But it was in 1879, when Thomas was 8 years old, that the Donnelly family faced their first real crisis since Vernon's return from war, a crisis that tested everything they had built together and revealed, in its resolution, the true depth of the love between Vernon and Gertrude. A prolonged drought struck the region that summer, the worst that Vernon could remember since before the war, threatening not just their own crops but those of every farmer throughout the county. As the weeks stretched into months without significant rainfall, the corn that formed the backbone of their farming operation began to fail, stalks withering in fields that should have stood tall and green with the promise of autumn harvest. The financial strain of a failed harvest threatened not just their immediate prosperity, but the very future they had worked so hard to build for their children. And Vernon found himself, for the first time in years, sliding back into the dark moods that had plagued him in the early years of his return from war, though this time the source of his distress was not memory but fear for his family's future. "We will manage," Gertrude told him, on an evening when he had returned from surveying the ruined cornfields with an expression of such despair that it worried her considerably. "We have savings, Vernon, and we have the orchard, which has fared better than the corn given its deeper roots, and we have each other. We will find a way through this, as we have found our way through everything else." "I fear I have failed you," Vernon said, sitting heavily at their kitchen table, the same table where Gertrude had once tended his war wound in the early days of their acquaintance. "I fear I have failed our children, that everything we have built together might crumble because I could not control the weather any more than I could control what happened at Franklin all those years ago." "You have not failed anyone," Gertrude said firmly, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to meet her eyes. "A drought is not a failure of character, Vernon Donnelly. It is simply a hardship that we must face together, as we have faced every other hardship since the day my wagon broke down on the road before your land. Do you remember what you told me then about neighbors helping each other survive?" "I remember," Vernon said. "That principle does not simply apply to strangers on the road," Gertrude said. "It applies to us, to our marriage, to this family we have built. I am your neighbor in the truest sense now, Vernon, your partner in every sense, and I will not allow you to face this drought alone in your mind, even if we must face it together in reality." Her words, along with the practical steps they took in the following weeks, drawing on savings and reducing expenses where possible, selling some of their livestock to raise necessary funds, and relying on the orchard's more successful harvest to supplement what income they could still generate, eventually saw them through the drought year with their farm intact, though considerably poorer than they had been the previous autumn. More than the practical solutions, however, it was Gertrude's steady presence throughout the crisis that reminded Vernon of the deeper truth their marriage had taught him. That peace was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of someone willing to face that hardship alongside you, someone whose love did not waver in the face of difficulty, but instead grew stronger, tested and proven by adversity rather than diminished by it. The drought broke in the spring of 1880, with rains that seemed almost miraculous in their timing, arriving just as the ground had begun to show the first cracks of true desperation. And the corn that year, planted with the particular hope of farmers who have weathered disaster and refused to give up, grew taller and more abundant than any harvest since Vernon's return from war. It was during the celebration of that bountiful harvest, a gathering that had grown over the years to include not just their immediate family, but the broader community of neighbors who had become friends through years of mutual support and shared hardship, that Vernon found himself reflecting, in conversation with an old veteran who had settled nearby some years after the war, on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment of contentment. "You fought at Franklin, did you not?" The neighbor, a man named Silas Croger who had served in a different Missouri regiment but had been present at the same terrible battle, asked as they shared a drink on the periphery of the harvest celebration. "I did," Vernon said. "Lost good friends there. Carried the weight of it for a long while after." "I understand that weight well enough myself," Silas said. "Though I confess, watching you here today, surrounded by this family you have built, this farm you have made prosper despite everything, I find myself wondering how you managed to set that weight down, at least enough to build something so clearly good from what remained of you after that terrible business." Vernon considered the question seriously, watching as Gertrude moved through the gathering, laughing with neighbors, checking on their children who ran wild with the other farm children in games that stretched across the harvested fields, her dark hair now showing the first threads of gray, but her energy and warmth undimmed by the years or the hardships they had faced together. "I did not set it down alone," Vernon said finally. "My wife helped me carry it, until eventually I found I could set portions of it aside, not because the weight had disappeared, but because I had learned I did not need to carry all of it every single day. She taught me that healing is not about forgetting what happened, but about learning to hold it alongside the good things that come after, without letting the bad entirely define what remains." "That is a wise woman," Silas said, following Vernon's gaze to where Gertrude now knelt beside their daughter Margaret, helping the girl bandage a scraped knee sustained in the enthusiasm of harvest games, her movements practiced and gentle in a manner that spoke to years of nursing experience. "The wisest I have known," Vernon agreed. "I count myself fortunate every single day that her wagon broke down on the road before my land, rather than somewhere else entirely, where some other man might have had the good fortune of helping her instead." The years continued to unfold with the particular richness that comes from a life built on solid foundations, foundations of hard work, mutual respect, and a love that had only deepened with time and shared experience. By 1885, their children had grown considerably, with Thomas, now 14, taking on increasing responsibility for the practical management of the farm's day-to-day operations, showing a maturity and capability that made both his parents proud, while Margaret, at 12, had become genuinely skilled in basic medical care, assisting her mother regularly in tending to sick or injured neighbors throughout the county. It was also in 1885 that Vernon and Gertrude welcomed their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Eleanor, born when Gertrude was 39 years of age, an event that surprised both of them somewhat given the years that had passed since Charles's birth, but that they welcomed with the same joy that had greeted each of their previous children. "I did not expect to be starting again with an infant at this stage of our lives," Gertrude admitted to Vernon, some weeks after Eleanor's birth, as they sat together watching Thomas, now considerably taller than his mother, help his younger siblings with evening chores while Vernon held the newest addition to their family. "I confess I did not either," Vernon said, "but I find I am grateful for it nonetheless. This little one will grow up on a farm that has already proven itself capable of weathering hardship and emerging stronger, surrounded by siblings who will teach her everything she needs to know about this life we have built. I consider that a fortunate beginning for any child. As Alina grew through her early years, the farm itself continued to prosper, expanding its operations to include not just the corn and wheat that had originally formed its backbone, but the orchard that Charles had taken particular interest in developing, along with a modest dairy operation that Margaret had suggested might supplement their income, while also providing practical education in animal husbandry for the younger children. By the time Alina reached her 5th birthday in 1890, the Donnelly farm had become one of the most successful operations in the county, known not just for its productivity, but for the particular character of the family that ran it, a family whose reputation for fairness in dealings with neighbors and generosity toward those facing hardship had spread throughout the region. It was around this time that Vernon, now approaching 50 years of age, found himself increasingly reflective about the journey that had brought him to this point in his life, a reflection prompted in part by a visit from an unexpected source. A woman who arrived at their farm on a spring afternoon in 1890, having traveled from Ohio specifically to locate the Donnelly farm based on information she had gathered from military records and old correspondence. "Mr. Donnelly?" the woman asked, as Vernon came in from the fields to find her waiting on his porch, an elderly woman perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes that held a particular kind of grief that Vernon recognized immediately, having seen it in his own reflection many times over the years following the war. "I am," Vernon said. "May I help you with something, ma'am?" "My name is Sarah Ashby," the woman said, and Vernon felt the years fall away suddenly, felt himself transported back to a battlefield in Tennessee where he had held a dying young soldier, and promised to deliver a message of love to a girl waiting faithfully in Ohio. "I believe you knew my late husband, Thomas Ashby, during the war." Vernon found himself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of this piece of his past, a piece he had carried quietly for over 20 years without ever knowing whether his letter had reached its intended recipient, whether the promise he had made to a dying boy had ever been fulfilled. "I received your letter," Sarah continued, when Vernon remained silent, "many years ago now in 1863, shortly after Thomas's death. I have carried it with me all these years, Mr. Donnelly, and I wanted, before I grew too old to make such a journey, to thank you personally for the comfort those words provided during the darkest time of my life." By this point, Gertrude had emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices, and seeing her husband's evident emotional state, moved quickly to his side, taking his hand in silent support even before understanding fully what had prompted such a reaction. "This is my wife, Gertrude," Vernon managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Gertrude, this is Sarah Ashby. Her husband was Thomas, the young soldier I told you about from Franklin." Understanding dawned immediately in Gertrude's expression, and she reached out to take Sarah's hand with the warmth that characterized all her interactions with those who had suffered loss. "Please, come inside," Gertrude said. "You must be tired from your journey, and I believe there is a great deal to discuss between the three of us." Over tea in their kitchen, the same kitchen where Gertrude had once tended Vernon's war wound in the early days of their acquaintance, Sarah Ashby shared the story of her life following Thomas's death, a life that had eventually included remarriage to a good man who had helped raise the child she had been carrying at the time of Thomas's death, a daughter now grown with children of her own, named Grace after Sarah's own mother. "I named my daughter's middle name after Thomas," Sarah said, "so that some part of him would continue in this world, even though he never had the chance to know she existed. Your letter, Mr. Donnelly, telling me of his final thoughts, of his love for me even in his last moments, helped me find the strength to continue, to raise our daughter with the knowledge that her father had loved her before she was even born, that he had died thinking of the family he hoped to build with me." "I am grateful beyond words that the letter reached you," Vernon said, "and that it provided some measure of comfort. I have wondered for over 20 years whether my words had any effect at all, given the chaos of that time and the uncertainty of mail delivery during the war." "They had every effect," Sarah assured him. "They allowed me to grieve properly, knowing that Thomas's final thoughts had been of love rather than fear or pain, and they gave me strength to build a life that honored his memory rather than simply mourning what might have been." The visit lasted 3 days, during which Sarah met the entire Donnelly family, sharing stories with the children about their father's wartime experience that Vernon himself had rarely spoken of even to his own family. Stories that helped Thomas, Margaret, Charles, and even young Alina understand more fully the sacrifices their father had made, the friends he had lost, and the particular kind of courage it had taken to build a peaceful life on ground that had once known only violence. Before Sarah's departure, she and Vernon walked together to the eastern ridge, now entirely transformed from its wartime origins into the flourishing orchard that Gertrude had planted and Charles had expanded, and Vernon shared with her the specific spot where he believed Thomas had fallen, based on his memory of the battle's geography. "He would be proud of what you have built here," Sarah said, surveying the orchard's spring blossoms, a sea of white and pink that seemed a fitting tribute to a young soldier who had never lived to see such peaceful beauty. "Thomas always spoke of returning to farm after the war, of building a life away from violence and conflict. I believe he would find great comfort in knowing that his sacrifice, in some small way, contributed to this peace you have created." After Sarah's departure, Vernon found himself changed in subtle but significant ways, the visit having provided a kind of closure he had not realized he still needed, a confirmation that his promise to Thomas Ashby had been fulfilled, that the young soldier's memory lived on not just in Vernon's own recollections, but in the daughter he had never known and the granddaughter who would carry his name forward into a new generation. "I feel as though a burden I had carried without fully realizing its weight has finally been set down," Vernon told Gertrude, as they lay together that night after Sarah's departure. "I have wondered for over 20 years whether my letter reached her, whether my promise to Thomas had been fulfilled or had simply disappeared into the chaos of that terrible time." "You fulfilled every promise you made," Gertrude said, holding him close. "And in doing so, you have honored not just Thomas's memory, but the memory of every friend you lost during the war, by building something good and lasting from the ashes of what they sacrificed themselves to preserve." As the 1890s progressed, the Donnelly farm continued to prosper, and the children grew toward adulthood with the particular grace that comes from being raised by parents who had themselves learned, through hardship and love both, what truly mattered in building a good life. Thomas, now in his 20s, had taken on primary management of the farm's agricultural operations, showing the same practical wisdom that had characterized his father's approach to farming, while also beginning to court a young woman from a neighboring farm, a courtship that Vernon and Gertrude watched with the particular pleasure of parents seeing their own love story echoed in the next generation. Margaret, meanwhile, had pursued formal medical training in St. Louis, becoming one of the first women in the region to receive proper certification as a nurse, and had returned to establish a small medical practice that served not just Lexington but the surrounding farming communities, following directly in her mother's footsteps, while also expanding beyond what Gertrude herself had been able to achieve given the more limited opportunities available to women during her own younger years. Charles had transformed the orchard into a genuinely profitable business, shipping preserved fruits and cider not just throughout the county, but to markets as far as Kansas City, and had married a young woman named Alice Prescott, whose family had settled in the region some years after the Donnellys, and who shared Charles's particular fondness for the land and its careful cultivation. Alina, the youngest, showed perhaps the most varied interests of all the Donnelly children, displaying talent in both the practical skills of farming and the more intellectual pursuits that her parents, both readers despite their busy lives, had encouraged in all their children. By her late teens, Eleanor had begun teaching at the small schoolhouse that had been established in Lexington, having decided that education represented her particular calling, a decision that made both her parents proud given their own understanding of how transformative learning and understanding could be in a person's life. It was in 1897, 30 years after Gertrude Keating's wagon had broken down on the road before Vernon Donnelly's land, that the couple celebrated their own particular anniversary with a quiet dinner on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that Vernon had, over the decades, learned to appreciate fully rather than viewing through the haze of remembered war that had once colored his every perception. 30 years, Gertrude said, taking Vernon's weathered hand in her own equally weathered but still capable fingers. I confess I did not expect, when my wagon broke down that spring afternoon, that I was about to encounter the great love of my life. Nor did I expect, Vernon said, that a broken wagon wheel would lead to everything I hold most precious in this world. This farm, our children, the peace I have found on ground that once knew only war and violence. I owe all of it to you, Gertrude, to your patience with a broken man and your determination to help him heal. We healed each other, Gertrude corrected gently. I came west carrying my own grief, my own uncertainty about how to build a life after losing everything I had known. You gave me purpose beyond simply surviving, Vernon, gave me a family and a home and a love that has sustained me through every hardship we have faced together since. They sat together as darkness settled over land that had, through their combined efforts and enduring love, transformed entirely from the scene of violence and destruction that had greeted Vernon upon his return from war, into something that now represented, in every possible sense, peace itself. A thriving farm, a loving family, and a marriage that had weathered every storm life had thrown against it while only growing stronger for the testing. Their children and grandchildren, for by this time Thomas had married and started his own family, gathered occasionally on that same porch, listening to stories of the war years and the courtship that had followed, stories that Vernon now told with an openness that would have seemed impossible in those first difficult months after his return from Tennessee, when silence had been his only companion in processing what he had witnessed and endured. "Tell us again about the wagon wheel, Grandpa," young Sarah, Thomas's eldest daughter, would request during these gatherings, having heard the story many times but never tiring of its particular romance, the tale of how her grandparents had met on a dusty Missouri road that had once seen far darker traffic during the terrible years of war. "Well," Vernon would begin, settling into the telling with the practiced ease of a story told many times but always with genuine affection, "your grandmother's wagon wheel had been rotting from the inside for months, though she did not know it at the time, having been sold that wagon by a man in Lexington who cared more for profit than honesty." And so the story would continue, told and retold across the years, becoming part of the family's history in the way that important stories do, passed down through generations as a reminder of how love can grow from unexpected circumstances, how healing can come from unexpected sources, and how even ground that has witnessed the worst of human conflict can, with enough patience and enough love, be transformed into something that nurtures life rather than destroying it. By 1900, as the new century dawned, Vernon Donnelly had reached his early 60s, his hair fully gray now, his limp more pronounced with the accumulated years, but no longer the source of pain it had once been, thanks to Gertrude's early treatments and the decades of careful management that had followed. Gertrude herself, in her mid-50s, remained as vital and engaged with life as she had been in her younger years, though her dark hair had long since turned to silver and her hands, once smooth, now showed the particular calluses and strength that came from decades of farm work combined with her continued nursing activities throughout the county. Their farm, now managed primarily by Thomas with continued involvement from Charles in the orchard operations, had become not just a source of income but a genuine legacy, a testament to what patient work and enduring love could build even from the most difficult beginnings. The Eastern Ridge, where Vernon had once trained for war and later proposed to Gertrude amid the fading scars of old trenches, now stood as a fully mature orchard, its trees providing not just fruit for the family's business, but a particular kind of beauty that visitors often remarked upon, never knowing the history of violence and loss that the ground beneath those peaceful trees had once witnessed. On a spring evening in 1902, as Vernon and Gertrude walked together through that same orchard, now accompanied by their first great-grandchild, a boy named after his great-grandfather, Vernon found himself reflecting once more on the particular journey that had brought him to this moment of profound contentment. "Do you remember," he asked Gertrude, as they watched young Vernon toddle unsteadily between the apple trees under his mother's careful supervision, "what you said to me, that very first day, about neighbors helping each other survive what was coming?" "I remember," Gertrude said, smiling at the memory that had proven so prophetic of everything that followed. "I did not know then how completely that principle would come to define our entire life together." "Nor did I," Vernon said. "I thought, that day, that I was simply helping a stranger whose wagon had broken down on the road before my land. I did not understand that I was, in fact, encountering the person who would help me finally set down the weight of war I had carried since Franklin, who would teach me that peace was possible even for a man who had witnessed and participated in such terrible violence." "You found that peace yourself, Vernon," Gertrude said. "I simply helped you recognize that you had already begun the journey toward it through your careful work on this land, your patience with the process of healing both the ground and yourself." "We found it together," Vernon corrected, echoing her own words from years before. "As we have found everything else that matters in this life, Gertrude, together." They stood together in that orchard, watching their great-grandson play among trees that had grown from ground that once knew only the sounds of battle and the sight of buried friends. And Vernon felt, as he often did in such moments, a profound gratitude for the particular series of events that had brought Gertrude Keating's broken wagon to his land on that spring afternoon so many years before. The peace he had found in farming that same ground where he had once trained for and been shaped by war had proven, in the end, to be inseparable from the peace he had found in loving Gertrude Keating, the two forms of healing so thoroughly intertwined that Vernon could no longer imagine one without the other. The land itself, transformed through decades of careful cultivation from a place of violence into a place of abundant life, stood as testament to what patient work and enduring love could accomplish, while their marriage, similarly transformed from an unlikely meeting between two grieving strangers into a partnership that had weathered every hardship life presented, stood as its own testament to the healing power of genuine love freely given and freely received. As evening settled over the orchard, painting the sky in the same rich colors that had first accompanied their courtship decades before, Vernon Donnelly took his wife's hand in his own, feeling the familiar comfort of her presence beside him after 35 years of marriage, and knew with complete certainty that whatever years remained to them, they would face together, as they had faced everything else, with the same partnership and love that had first blossomed on a Missouri road where a broken wagon wheel had led, against all expectation, to a lifetime of profound and lasting happiness. Their story, passed down through children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, would continue to be told for generations, a reminder that even the most terrible circumstances, even ground scarred by war and loss, could become the foundation for something beautiful and enduring, if approached with patience, hard work, and above all, a willingness to love fully despite the risk of further loss that such love inevitably carried. Vernon Donnelly had returned from war seeking simply to survive, to work the land that had raised him in hopes of finding some measure of peace after years of violence and death. He had found, instead, something far more profound. A partner who understood his wounds because she carried her own, a family that grew from that partnership into something neither of them could have imagined during those first difficult months of his return, and a peace that extended far beyond the simple absence of conflict into something richer and more complete, a peace built on love freely given and received, on hard work shared between equals, and on the fundamental belief that even the most damaged ground, whether literal soil or wounded hearts, could be healed through patient, dedicated care. As the sun set fully on that spring evening in 1902, Vernon and Gertrude Donnelly walked back toward their farmhouse together, their great-grandson now sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, the orchard behind them standing silent testament to 35 years of love, hard work, and the particular kind of peace that comes only to those who have known its opposite intimately and chosen, despite everything, to build something better from what remained. Their story had begun with a broken wagon wheel on a dusty Missouri road, but it had grown, through the years, into something far more significant, a testament to the healing power of love, to the possibility of finding peace even in ground that had witnessed the worst of human conflict, and to the particular kind of courage required to open one's heart fully to love again after experiencing profound loss and violence. It was, in every sense that mattered, a story with a truly happy ending, not because either Vernon or Gertrude had escaped hardship entirely, but because they had faced that hardship together, had built something lasting and beautiful from difficult beginnings, and had found in each other exactly the kind of partnership that allowed both of them to heal fully from the wounds their respective pasts had inflicted, creating in the process a legacy of love and peace that would continue through their children and grandchildren for generations to come.